Fantastic. I'm Peter Watts. I'm the Director for Cybersecurity Policy and Response at the National Security Council. It's an honor to be here today. It's a pleasure to talk about cybersecurity and cybersecurity education as a national security issue. I'll be your moderator for this afternoon's panel. Today we're going to be focusing on how we can develop the next generation of cybersecurity leaders, as well as build a diverse workforce. We'll also be looking at how the public and private sectors can cooperate with one another, and as well as foster insight and better comprehension among all young people about the threats in cybersecurity and the risks it poses for the nation as a whole. Just to put the issue into perspective, on May 30, 2018, DHS and Commerce released a report on supporting the growth and sustainment of the nation's cybersecurity workforce. It provided a huge outline and outlined the challenges and opportunities out there on bringing people into the field. Veterans, minorities, women, as well as other students in secondary school. It also found apparent shortages of knowledgeable and skilled cybersecurity educators and teachers. As of 2017, August, there were an estimated 300,000 active openings for cybersecurity-related fields. And that's just in the United States. By 2022, globally, that number is estimated to reach 1.8 million people in terms of cybersecurity workforce gap. We have a huge road ahead of us in terms of building up to that gap or reducing that gap, but I definitely think it's something that we can overcome, and it's a huge opportunity for us as a nation. It's a pleasure to be here with four very distinguished panelists. On my left, Terry Garcia. Terry is the COO of the National Cyber Education Group. Before that, he was with National Geographic Society, as well as a deputy secretary with the Department of Commerce. Terry, let me ask you, how did you get into cyber?
The Titanic. So as Peter said, I spent quite a few years at National Geographic, 17 in fact, and one of the projects that I was involved in was a project with Bob Ballard, the underwater explorer, and he was doing some work for the Navy. If you don't know the backstory, doing some work for the Navy, looking for a sub that had been lost, and in the course of that, stumbled across the Titanic. And anyway, after Bob found the Titanic, he received something like 15,000 letters from kids saying, "How can I become you?" And Bob said, well, you know, the answer is really simple. You go to school, you spend 10 years studying physics, and it's a snap after that. But the kids had not been connecting the work that's required of you to obtain the degree and the expertise and the fun he was having out in the field. And so we created a program called the JASON Project, which was designed to educate the next generation of scientists and explorers. And it led me into other aspects of education and dealing with young people because it hammered home the fact that we really are doing them a disservice because we weren't equipping kids with the skills they needed. And even more alarming in the sciences, we were losing kids at about the 10th grade. And what we were trying to do with this small JASON's project was to somehow keep that spark of curiosity, that enthusiasm that every kid is born with, is naturally has. But the education system at about the 9th grade was extinguishing it. And so that was my introduction, and I've continued that interest to the present day.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Terry. Next, Suzanne Thompson. Suzanne is a Senior Vice President for Corporate Education Partnerships at Discovery Education. She is a career educator with 20 years experience in education, teaching, as well as a superintendent of schools. Suzanne, let me ask you the same question as well. How did you get into cyber? What brought you into the field?
So, a fantastic question, Peter. Thank you so much. There are three specific channels that caused me to be very engaged in this topic. One, as a superintendent of schools and entering the digital environment, one, I wanted my students to be passionate about using digital and using all the things that surround that arena effectively, safely, with tons of innovation. I wanted them to feel capable and confident to grasp that environment with the right skills. But also as a superintendent, I felt compelled to ensure that safety and privacy were a primary concern of ours, definitely. I think the second channel is, as a private citizen, these devices have become such an important part of our world, and my nature is the kind of nature that wants to tackle problems and see things as an opportunity to advance our knowledge, to advance our society, to look for space within challenge to find a really positive solution. And I think the third component is my work at Discovery currently. And we take great pride in pulling together and designing and developing digital educational solutions. And we want to be sure those digital education solutions are cutting edge, and that educators, parents, community members, the corporate or nonprofit or governmental agencies that we work with have a tremendous confidence in those solutions, both from the quality of the technicality associated with those, but also the security components. And I think there's never a time before when data and information has been so compelling to drive our decisions. And so we want to make sure that we're collecting fantastic information that help us drive decisions that are spot on, whether that be for superintendents or teachers or parents or community members or our business partners. And we want to do so with a tremendous amount of security and integrity and high quality. So that's why this topic is so important to me.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Next, Sid Kaza. Sid is the chairperson of the Computer and Information Sciences Department at Towson University. His main interest is, of course, cybersecurity, education, as well as learning sciences. One interesting fact about Towson University is that it's one of the centers of academic excellence here in the Maryland area, and it has quite a number of cybersecurity faculty focused on various issues in the field. Sid, I will ask you the same question as well. What drew you to cybersecurity?
Okay, so when I heard the Titanic story, I wanted to start with something as big and as sad. So in 2001, when I was doing my doctorate, my advisor, who was from NYU, was in University of Arizona, and 9/11 happened. And when 9/11 happened, we were sitting together, and he said, that was the subway station that I used to take my train from. And we sort of pivoted to this very national security focus. At the time when DHS started, we started focusing on national security issues. So till about 2008, I was focusing on national security issues primarily from the border crossing perspective, very physical as opposed to cyber at the time. But I was doing a lot of data mining and focusing on border crosses at the southwestern border. And it became really important for me to hook in to this idea that we really have an issue here that is hard to solve, at the time more physical, but cyber was coming in a big way, and we realized that it wasn't really the physical borders. And that is what I think hooked me into the mission. But when I started in 2008 at Towson, we started focusing on cyber, and we started focusing, my group and my colleagues, and we started focusing on teaching secure coding. And our idea there was cyber is not really about something narrowed, not just about network protection, not just about policy, but there is a lot of code involved. And here we are running a program with 2,000 majors who are going out there in our region, in the region that we live in, especially with respect to cyber coding. And we really need to teach them how to code securely from the get-go. So my first big project in cyber was teaching secure coding right along with, for people who code here, right along with the if statements and the for loops. When you learn those, you learn cyber. And how do you protect your code from adversaries? So that was essentially the start. Since then, we've been working a lot on teaching cyber in coding courses, but beyond that, talking more about cyber for all. The entire idea that everybody, I'm the academic here, clearly, along with Suzanne, that everybody coming out of our universities and schools should have some introduction to cyber, and it's not just about the ninjas that we are training here. So we started focusing on that. Since then, I've been involved in curriculum development, but also guideline development. Some of you may have heard, I'm fairly sure, given the audience, most of you haven't, but ACM, the Association of Computing Machinery, which essentially publishes guidelines for computer science and information technology and information systems and software engineering, that essentially are 4,000 higher education institutions, public and private, sort of use as a guideline, just released its cybersecurity guideline. So I was part of that effort and a few others that we'll be talking about. But I think the big deal here is I come to it, again, from a national security point of view, which is why I was so excited to be invited.
Thank you very much, Sid. Brian Goucher, he's the division chief for NSA's College of Cyber. He's responsible for a number of different NSA cyber training programs and education programs, including GenCyber, which focuses on K through 12. Before joining NSA, Brian was with the Air Force as an officer. Brian, how did you get into cyber?
Okay, so a long time ago, back in the 80s, I was a staff sergeant in the Air Force, and the Air Force gave me an opportunity I couldn't refuse, so they sent me to University of Texas to get a computer science degree, and along the way I found out it would be a lot easier to be a second lieutenant than to make E6. So after getting the second lieutenant, to tell you how long ago it was, I was a mainframe systems programmer back in the day. I did that in San Antonio, and then my last assignment in the Air Force was up at NSA. So I transitioned from being a system programmer to do penetration testing, intrusion detection, those types of information assurance, what's now called cyber defense ideas. And then along the way, I've since moved on. Before my current position, I was a visiting professor at the Army War College as the NSA visiting professor, and got a chance to hopefully influence the next generation of leaders for the military services.
Thank you very much, Brian. Terry, we'll start off with a question for you.
Okay.
Can you frame the cybersecurity education challenge for us?
Okay, that's a big question. Maybe what I'll do is provide a little bit of context for the problem that we're facing in terms of a skills gap. And Peter referenced some of this in his introduction, but I've got some statistics that I just wanted to put out there because I think it helps really drive home the importance of this. So the percentage of organizations in the private sector that are now reporting a shortage of cybersecurity skills, in 2015 it was 25%. Today, in 2018, it's 51%. The number of cybersecurity jobs in the United States that are unfilled, in 2015 it was 200,000 roughly. 2018, it's 300,000. The Bureau of Labor Statistics estimates that there's going to be a very steep growth rate in cybersecurity of some 28% by 2026. The number of cybersecurity jobs that are predicted to be unfilled by 2021, and the numbers are kind of fluid, but most of the surveys indicate somewhere between 3 million and 3.5 million. The number keeps going up, so it's not going to get smaller, probably larger. And a recent survey of professionals in the field, again, in the private sector, 59% of them responded that their company did not have the skills to ensure against extreme or moderate risk in this arena. So the gap is huge. and regionally, globally rather, it is huge. The largest gap or percentage of individuals who are rather jobs that are unfilled is Asia Pacific, followed by North America, followed by Europe, and then Latin America. And then finally, women make up only 15 to 20% of the cybersecurity workforce. So it's a huge jobs gap or skills gap, and a very undiverse workforce that we're dealing with. And one of the approaches, one of the solutions that we're advocating is that we need to begin at K through 12. We need to overhaul how we are approaching this topic. We need to be able to properly engage kids and to do it in a way that is going to stick. I used that example of the Jason project a moment ago. We employed their multimedia, and Suzanne will probably also talk about this, but the opportunities that are presented by the latest advances in media technology and how we communicate. Kids these days are digital natives. Everybody out in this audience is a digital immigrant. Those digital natives are very comfortable with the latest technology, and we need to be employing that in the classroom. And I'll speak more about that later on in the program.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to shift to you, Brian, right now. What is NSA and DoD doing to attract and develop the future cyber workforce?
Sure, thank you for the question. When I talk about what NSA is doing, it's not just for NSA. So we have a number of national programs. One is called GenCyber. Let me just pause and say that everything I say is unclassified, and everything I say you can Google and find out. If you want to learn more about GenCyber or NSA CAEs, just Google it. It's all straight out there. But for the last 5 years, we've been running a program called GenCyber, where we issue grants to universities to let them run summer camps for K through 12 students. The idea behind that is we don't micromanage it, and we don't tell the schools how to do that. They put in a proposal and tell us how they're going to be innovative. We don't tell them how they're going to be innovative, but they tell us. So we look for them to put on hands-on summer camps, not summer schools. Last year, we did 150 of those camps, and we're geared towards female, minority, and economically disadvantaged students. Just to try to go towards the point that was made earlier, 50% of the students who come through GenCyber are female, and a significant number of them are minority students. So we run those GenCyber camps for students and for teachers. Last year we ran, there was 4,000 students and 1,000 teachers from across the United States. We were able to have camps in 43 states. Hopefully that's something that is for the greater good of not just NSA, maybe some of those folks will come to NSA, but predominantly we were trying to get more folks interested in cyber so that not all the students who go through GenCyber camps are going to be computer scientists or engineers. But we want them to be interested in cyber so that if they go into the nursing field, there's going to be a cyber component to that. If they go into accounting or business, there's a cyber component to that. So we want to give them an appreciation for cyber and also influence them. We give guidelines to talk about best practices. So we're trying to get them to be aware of social media and the problems associated with that. But again, we're not micromanaging how those programs are executed. We're just giving the guidelines, and in partnership with the National Science Foundation, issuing grants to universities across the country.
Sid, this would probably be a good seg into discussing a little bit about the efforts of Towson University, especially since you're a CAE. What are the efforts right now to further the cybersecurity education curriculum, as well as support the government sector on some of these programs?
Since I'm a professor, I'm going to start with an exercise here. I just made this up, as I usually do in my classroom. So here we are. I'd like all of you to raise your left or right hand straight up in the air. All of you. Okay. Now look around you and see the hands, please. It's a nice visual demonstration. Look around you, look behind you. See those hands? Imagine these are all department chairs like me, sitting in a room And the question that was just asked was, how many of you have 1 or 2 faculty positions empty in cybersecurity? And that's you. And I can guarantee, you can put your hands down. You're definitely better than my students. They don't listen to me. But I can guarantee you that if you were in a room sitting with faculty like this would be the answer. And there lies the problem as far as post-secondary and higher education is concerned. It is a problem where we have faculty who are not there. We have doctorate students who didn't graduate in cybersecurity. And if they did, they're going to the industry. Nothing wrong with that, but they're not coming to academic institutions to teach the next generation of the workforce. So we run into an issue where we don't just have faculty issues, but what we don't have in addition to those faculty missing is curriculum. Going back to the question that you asked me, Peter, even if we had those faculty, we don't have the curriculum to teach with. What we've been doing in academia, at least the last 15 years or so, and definitely hand in glove with the CAE program, is to build not just the faculty, but also the curriculum, along with the guidance on what that curriculum should be, which is where the CAE program comes in. We look at the CAE program, we look at the curricular guidelines, the ACM curricular guidelines, the IEEE curriculum guidelines. We look at accreditation, and what we try to find out is how can we align with the needs of the CAE program in cyber defense, or the CAE program in cyber operations, which is, in my opinion, very NSA focused, and how can we align our curriculum to those needs. Given the region that we are in, it also becomes a very interesting phenomenon where Towson, where it is, or you can count all the institutions in our geographical area, we are answering to almost a different call. I think we are answering to more of a DoD call, whereas the other institutions are not so much. So I think there's a lot of variables there in play, but the CAE program really gives us the guiding direction, among other things, to build that curriculum. And I'm sure we'll talk a little bit more about that, of specific programs there as well.
Suzanne, we've been talking a lot about cyber education at sort of the professional level, but what about the K through 12 level? How does cybersecurity content fit right now into the core K through 12 curriculum? And what can we do? What are the best practices for engaging students to go into a field like this?
Okay, so 2 parts. How does cybersecurity fit into the K-12 curriculum? And then how are we engaging students around that? So when I think about cybersecurity, Terry certainly talked about the tremendous workforce gap. So we know that part of our responsibility in education is to ensure that students and teachers are aware of workforce skills and are aware of workforce needs. So when I think about the K-12 curriculum, I think about skills like algorithmic thinking, high quality oral and written skills to be able to write about or speak about complex topics. I think about all of the skills associated with problem solving. I think about connecting the importance of relevancy and real world dilemmas as key pillars to engage students into their worlds and what's happening around them. I think about skills like risk analysis, understanding complex sets of information and deconstructing that information and building it back up. I think about helping train our students having being great askers of questions and digging through information and testing things. Those are all skills that currently align directly to various elements of K-12 academic standards. Whether those academic standards are coming from a particular school district's curriculum or the Common Core or the NGSS or the K-12 computing framework. All of those skills are already deeply embedded in our curriculum. I think the beauty of what I love about part of the work we do at Discovery is helping make connections between those existing curricular standards and the relevancy of a world or an environment like cybersecurity. I can teach problem solving, and you have to raise your hand if you recognize this problem. I can teach problem solving by saying, there was a train traveling from the West Coast at 85 miles an hour and a train traveling from the East Coast at 120 miles an hour, and I hear the laughter already. Or I can say, there's a group of hikers, and they've reached the summit of this particular mountain, and they've noticed that the weather's starting to change, and they've decided they don't have enough time to get back down the mountain, so they've radioed down for some assistance. The helicopter pilot and emergency professionals are making a determination if they can get the helicopter up to the top in time before the storm moves in. When we present students with highly relevant problems that are associated with the real world, and imagine all of those problems and scenarios in the cyber environment. The list goes on and on that are real world issues associated with our students' day-to-day lives. When we create educational programming that takes the foundationally critically important elements of the K-12 curriculum and attach that to highly relevant, Terry talked a little bit about the multimodal nature of media and technology, and that intersection increases student engagement dramatically. So when we pull all those things together and design instructional programs that help educators see the relevancy, whether it's through career vignettes or problem solving, and they see the connections to the skills we're learning in 3rd grade or 8th grade or 11th grade, and they can see the connections between the career and industry, that helps the educator feel empowered and successful to help prepare their students for that pathway. And it gives students a real reason to dive in and be really interested in these issues.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Terry, would you like to comment?
Yeah. One of the other issues that we're confronting is distribution. And my analogy, I default to the media because that's my background. You can have the greatest story on the planet, and people used to come to me with all sorts of great ideas for stories that they wanted to tell on television. The problem is, if you don't have a way of distributing that story, if you don't have a platform that will get it to a mass audience, it doesn't matter. Nobody's ever going to hear it. Nobody really cares. And to a certain extent, that's one of the challenges that we're confronting now in education, particularly cybersecurity and what we're talking about. There are a lot of efforts underway to create curriculum materials, and there's a lot of good stuff out there that is being developed, really tremendous. The problem is, how do you get it into the hands of kids, in the hands of teachers, and to the network of public and private schools in the United States? We're working, the organization I'm with, the National Cyber Education Group, is developing a partnership with Discovery Education and a public-private initiative to begin that process. Because one of the as I said, the critical weaknesses that we have is, how do we distribute it? Well, these guys happen to have a platform that hits 30 million kids. So right away, we have an opportunity to begin to push this out and reach that mainstream student body. So distribution is a huge issue. And also, I wouldn't say most, but many kids and many teachers, most of the public, don't know the range of career opportunities out there for people in this space, and we have to do a better job of communicating that. So it's not all about coding, and that's part of it, but there are other avenues that students can pursue, policy, government, law, you name it. And we need to begin to incorporate that in the instructional materials and how we're communicating this to kids. And thirdly, to Suzanne's point, it's got to be interesting. It has to be exciting. We have to be able to communicate it in a way that engages students so that they are excited about the opportunities, and then to keep that interest, that excitement going.
Turning to Sid, on a related question, how can a university make a difference with this workforce shortage? How can we engage the next generation?
Well, I think there is a big question of the pipeline, which is where I think we said from K through 12 on to community colleges and four-year institutions. I think there is still a fairly big disconnect in what is happening, the efforts at K through 12 and what is happening in higher education. I think the major pain point right now is not just there is a lack in that pipeline of the number of students reaching higher education, but there is a lack of diversity in that pipeline already. So when students reach higher education, we already have a very narrow set of demographics that we are dealing with. I think so there's really two sets of efforts. One is the curriculum effort, where what is being mentioned here is in fact extremely important, right? That platform to get a wide audience in K through 12, and then also working with the higher education to make sure that there is in fact a mesh there. Usually a mesh happens eventually, right? I mean, this is even though I do believe cybersecurity education is unique in many ways. Primarily because we have to operate at a speed in terms of curriculum, in terms of relevance that didn't quite exist in other disciplines. But then again, some of these problems have existed for a while. We have looked at sciences, we have looked at math. We haven't addressed even computer science. I'm glad we are into cyber, but computer science has its own problems to deal with the interface between K through 12 and higher education. So one really is that interface. And I think the second thing is the career idea, right? Unfortunately, in K through 12, we are still living in a world of fairly narrow career choices that students think about based on what is in fact the core curriculum, which in fact is quite narrow. It is still based on the sciences. We are gunning towards STEM, and I think that is great for us as a nation, but it's not the only thing we should be doing. And I think that's where we have sort of pivoted, that we need to be doing only STEM, and even cyber spans beyond STEM. And I think we are already narrowing our focus quite a bit in the core curriculum, which we shouldn't have. But really the career idea is really important, where we have students coming through K through 12 thinking beyond what they saw in their classroom and what they took their APs on. Right, and essentially everything sort of focuses in the APs, and there isn't a cyber AP, and I can assure you there won't be for a long time. So how does one address those issues?
Thank you very much, Sid. Brian, two-part question. Where do you see the gaps in our strategic efforts to build a cyber workforce? And two, how can we better address those gaps? How can we better retain our cyber workforce?
So I'd piggyback on what Sid said a little bit earlier. The feedback that we've got from academia, and let me just go back and talk about the Centers of Academic Excellence. There's 266 of them, and go off on a tangent with that later on. But the input that we get from academia is that the gaps are, you can't train the students if you don't have the faculty to train them. And part of the problem that we have right now is we don't have a sufficient number of faculty to do cyber education. So I think the question is there a role for government involvement in that? There's different scholarship programs that the DoD and the National Science Foundation have, but that's focused on getting people their degrees, and the commitment is pay back to government. I think it's worthwhile to look to see if the government should be involved to have some sort of scholarship programs where the payback is to academia, because unless we face that reality of the shortage of faculty, the pipeline is just not going to be sustainable, that we can get enough people with the throughput that we need, as was mentioned earlier, with the gaps to get that end result if we don't have the sufficient number of faculty. So I think the question is whether there should be government involvement in that, and what that government involvement should be. Perhaps I would suggest as some sort of scholarship program with a payback being going back to academia, because as Sid mentioned earlier, the economic realities of it is that academia can't compete when you get people who get their PhDs in computer science to go into academia versus even go to work for the government or to go to work for private industry. It's just not a level playing field as far as how academia can compete academically. And I forget the second question.
How do we better retain the cyber workforce, keep them engaged?
Okay, so I'll talk about that from an NSA perspective and from a DoD perspective. At NSA, there's kind of a pecking order almost, so to speak, and everybody has the same issues. Everybody has the same problem, retention of talent. So the military services have that problem because a person who goes in the military, whether they're a young junior NCO or a young officer, there's no incentive for them to stay in financially because they can easily go out and make a lot more money. At NSA, it's the same thing. I mean, typically the pecking order is we take military people and bring them in NSA because we can pay them more. They come to NSA and then they go to private industry because they can get more, that way. At NSA, the way we're trying to fight that, part of it is financial, where we have a separate pay scale for folks who are computer scientists. It's about 15% or so where we pay them more. We also have retention bonuses, similar to the way the military has retention or enlistment bonuses based upon certain skill fields. At the DoD level, the DoD is also now looking at having a separate pay scale for cyber. The problem that they're running into is the idea of trying to standardize between the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines and make it a DoD policy, because everybody talks in a different language. And how do you talk about an AFSC versus an MOS versus a military specialty in the Marines? So standardizing that is an issue. But I know at the DoD CIO level, they're looking at having that separate pay scale to be able to incentivize folks to stay in the services in the cyber field.
I'm not exactly sure what you're talking about. I'm making all kinds of money.
So NSA grants don't count, Sid.
No,
okay.
not at all.
Peter, what? Another point, and I thought you were going to go there, is that we also need to rethink, this is in the private sector now, hiring managers about college degrees and whether or not they're necessary. There's this concept of new-collar jobs that I think IBM coined the phrase, which require some technical training, but they don't necessarily require a 4-year degree. And we're really not geared to handle that appropriately either. And so a new emphasis on that. We need to have, some kind of financial incentives also for the private sector. There was an effort last year with the New Collar Act, or New Collar Jobs Act, which was going to provide financial incentives like tax credits, deferment or forgiveness of student loans in this area. So we're going to have to be a little more creative than we've been in the past, because the situation is pretty dire and we don't have time to just keep trying the same old thing. And there are other ideas out there. Someone has floated the idea of, why not do something like with AmeriCorps, where you have a program that is set up to induce graduates to come into the government, focus in this area, and commit to a couple of years, and then they go back out. And again, there can be other financial incentives attached to that. So I think there are a lot of different things that we could be doing, and not just focused on a 4-year college degree. And communicate that, by the way, in the K through 12 programs, so that kids know that there not only are there these other career opportunities, but there are alternative education paths that can be pursued that will land them in really interesting careers.
Yeah, and Peter, I'd actually like to pull together some of the comments that have been made at a very tactical level. we're talking about career and workforce gaps. We're talking about awareness of these careers. And as digital storytellers at Discovery, a really important part and some things that Terry and I have talked about is making sure that students and teachers can see what exists in this industry. So being very thoughtful, we spend an awful lot of time gathering career vignettes where we're in a work environment, on location, getting a 30-second or 2-minute snapshot of what someone is doing in their job. Because if a 13-year-old has no idea what this future looks like and can't see it, it's very hard for them to either engage in it or even to plan for it. So when students are watching, wait, that's what you do in your job? And those are how you pull together my science skills, my math skills, my art skills, my creative thinking skills, and you've pulled all those skills together and you're doing this really cool job. And when we wrap that around with high quality curriculum, when we wrap that around the instructional tools that help teachers understand how do I use this career vignette, not only for my students, but parents become a really powerful component of this conversation, and community members. So when we present students and teachers with the opportunity to see what's happening in this universe and what's happening, I think there's a level of conversation that goes on about cyber. The amount of people in this industry, the amount of people working on this topic is kind of below the radar. When we expose that through fantastic applications of video or media and we distribute it, suddenly you create an environment where students and teachers are dialoguing and starting to create that level of awareness that I think is really important to this conversation.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Each of you in your points touched upon quite a variety of issues, a broad swath of issues. One of them was also public-private partnerships. Brian, you had mentioned that. Terry, you had also mentioned AmeriCorps, for instance. I'd like to open up this question to the panel. Are there any other suggestions on how the public sector and private sector can be working together?
Loads. I think as a superintendent, exactly, Terry, where do we start? I think as people often say to me, if you were to go back to the superintendency, what's something you might do differently? Usually my first response is I would reach out aggressively to industry, to corporations, to agencies, to the military, to all kinds of organizations and stakeholders that are in my community to open up all kinds of channels of dialogue. So, you know, one of the things that we're so proud of in the work we currently do is helping connect our corporate partners, our educational agencies together, because our schools just don't have the resources they wish they had. And I think when we partner together, we start to solve some of these problems, we start to address some of these big questions. So I think being here today, you know, having this kind of dialogue and continuing creating forums like this, reaching out to educational partners and opening those doors for conversation, for me, is definitely an important starting point.
Yeah, I think this issue itself is an ideal one for building a very successful public-private partnership. It's not a partisan issue. Yep. This is an issue where the threat is very clear. It's an existential threat. And we have an opportunity to begin to combine the resources of both government and the private sector to achieve, you know, our mutual goals. And we can begin that here. And I think it's a very appealing issue that should lead to a very robust public-private partnership.
Yeah, I'm definitely seconding that. I think it's in all of, when we think about disciplines and we talk about applicability of what is done in K through 12 in education and in higher education institutions as well, cyber is actually quite unique. I think two things are happening. One, it is as a discipline unique in the sense that it's broad. So we are in a situation where we have really a lot of stakeholders here who are thinking about cyber in different ways and reacting to cyber in their environments. and this includes obviously public institutions, and specifically DoD institutions who have a whole different view of cyber, and private institutions. But I think the important thing also is I would say that in general, we need to come together on this, because I don't believe that most of the nation's population even begins to understand the threat we are in. So I think in this audience, we are able to say what kind of dire consequences, or even begin to imagine dire consequences, that in fact it is an existential threat. I don't believe that the average, and you said the right word, parent knows that, right? And parents are, of course, a big driving force. One, at least they think they are in K through 12, but they're also a big driving force in higher education. And that's where kids are going. That's where our workforce is going. And I don't think that there is enough of a dialogue going on publicly about the threat of cyber. We are obviously seeing the daily news, but I don't think people are understanding the entire scope of the problem, what can be prevented, what cannot be prevented, what we need to do, what we can do, and the risk. I think risk is the other big word. I don't think we are able to even, most people don't even understand what the risk is, but also don't begin to understand that there are some things we just cannot do. You know, this is not, and I don't think we can close the door on this one, right? And I don't think people really understand that. I don't think they're able to weigh the pros and cons of the choices they are making every day and the choices that their kids are making every day. So I completely concur that this is really an opportunity where we need to talk more, and definitely talk much more outside this room. So people know what we're facing.
Yeah, I'll just say I completely agree with everything. Going back to even General Stewart this morning when he talked about sharing information, the cyber and the threat. It's not a government problem. It's not an intelligence problem. It's not a military problem. It's a societal problem, and it impacts everybody equally.
Great, thank you very much, Brian. I'm going to turn the mic over to the floor now for a little bit of Q&A before we close with some remarks from each of our panelists. Do we have any questions?
Sure. For Mr. Goucher, your experience at the War College, how do we get the non-cyber senior leaders out there, the general officers and the CEOs, to know what they should know about cyber to make informed decisions?
Okay, I think one of the ground rules that wasn't explained is that anybody who has taught with me is not allowed to ask questions from the audience. So Ben Leitzel, you're called out. And could you repeat your question again?
Yeah, it's a challenge that we've dealt with for years. How do we get the non-cyber senior leaders, the CEOs and the general officers, informed about cyber to make informed decisions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and actually that comes back to something that my friend Judy Emil and I were talking about at lunchtime. Judy, wait, thank you. Do you take a leader and inform them about cyber, or do you take a cyber person and make them a leader? I think reverting back to my time at the War College, and I think along the military philosophy of a commander is responsible for everything. I'll quote General Alexander when he came up to Carlisle saying, the buck stops with you as a commander. So as a military leader, and I think the analogy is the same whether you're in private industry or not, but if you're the CEO, if you're the commander, then you can't blame your subordinates. It's incumbent upon you to become at least cyber savvy. So if you're the brigade commander and the lieutenant or the staff sergeant comes up and says, we have a DDoS against our system, you have to know what he's talking about. Not that you can work all the details, but you have to at least be cyber savvy. So I think, Ben, the things that we did before at Carlisle and the things that you're continuing there, the electives as we try to influence our upcoming senior leaders at the War College, and then permeating that down through, in the military sense, at CGSC, and then even, down to the service academies, making folks more and more aware of cyber, not that they're the computer programmers, but that they're aware of cyber, that they know what their risks are, that, cyber defense is the big issue for them. I used to always say that, sure, there are cyber operations and people are going to hack back, but it's not going to be you. you're responsible, the primary number of folks who are out there in leadership positions are responsible for cyber defense. So they have to be aware of what cyber is. They have to know good cyber hygiene. They have to put their money where their mouth is and invest in cybersecurity, whether that be in the military or whether that be in the private sector. Did that answer anywhere close, Ben? Okay, thanks. I'll catch you later.
Good afternoon, gentlemen and ma'am. My name is Midshipman Anthony Perry from the U.S. Naval Academy. Now, I'm just going to give a little bit of personal background before I ask my question. I'm from Massachusetts, and what we have are vocational schools. So half the time we dedicate to purely academics. The other half we spend in a technical trade. I learned how to become an electrician, and then I decided to come to the Naval Academy and not use any of that skills. But the point is, there's a dedicated track of, okay, here's some real life knowledge, some skills, some technical skills that you can actually use whenever you graduate after high school. Now, my superintendent called me the other day, and he's very excited about the possibility of using cyber as one of those shop curriculums. I was just asking, I have a meeting with him next week. Are there any recommendations that the panel has of what programs or what sort of opportunities there are? I did write down CyCON, so I will be going through that, but I just wanted to see if you had any recommendations. Thank you.
So it's a great question, and as an educator and someone who's very, very closely tied into academic programs, I'm working with a career and technical institute in Pennsylvania. I think the idea of having a career and technical track associated with cyber is absolutely brilliant. And I think from a content standpoint, pulling upon some of the tools that this panel has mentioned, even looking at something like the K-12 computer science framework, which has a lot of these elements associated with it, as does the next generation science standards. I also think that it's broader. The curricular implications can be broadened to K-12, but I definitely would encourage you, and I'm happy to connect with you afterwards as well. And I'm sure there's some great advice from the other panelists as well, but I think the intention of pursuing opportunities to pay attention and to carve out opportunities to specifically learn in this space is really important.
Okay.
Okay. First of all, it's a hard problem to recognize what in fact would be in a vocational course in cyber at the high school level. There are plenty examples, so one would want to look at them. And again, as Suzanne said, I would like to talk to you after the fact to give you some of those examples as well. There is a lot of work on guidelines in cyber as well in K through 12. There are courses that folks have run in high school and in sophomore years on cyber. There is a program, I'm not sure if I'm stepping on your toes here.
Okay. I was going to mention it, but you go ahead.
Don't cut off my funding.
Okay. Be nice.
Yeah. So there is a program by NSA which is called the National Cybersecurity Curriculum Program, NCCP. And if you Google that, you should find it, but I will give you the actual URL as well. But the National Cybersecurity Curriculum Program is working with faculty both at higher secondary institutions and in K-12 to build curriculum, but curriculum in a way that K-12 can in fact consume, which is very interesting because one of the big problems, and I don't want to say this for too long, but in higher secondary institutions, professors, including myself, the way we teach and the way we build curriculum is completely incompatible with consumption at K through 12. So I'm glad there are better people doing that. But this particular program is building curriculum that is focused not just at higher secondary institutions, but at K through 12. And it gives you nice modules that can be used in K through 12. But I think the biggest thing in K through 12 is not just the vocational training, but it's really the security mindset, the interest, right? Because There's some things that you can do in a training school at K-12, and I think the nation's needs are not just those, but so much beyond that, that I think it would also be interest generating. What we need is generating interest so we go on to the next step, so we can answer more needs. So we will, I'm sure, talk, but I wanted to put in a plug for NSA here.
So let me just give a little background quick to what Sid mentioned. 2 years ago, NSA was fortunate enough to get what I call a big wheelbarrow full of money. Called the Cybersecurity National Action Plan, and we were given about $37 million. What we did with part of that was to solicit universities to do this curriculum development. So a number of universities are putting together this curriculum. The digital library is being housed at Towson. Sid's responsible for that. So that's the effort is a national effort that Towson is kind of heading up, but it's actually being put together by a number of universities from all across the country. The other thing I was going to mention is that there's a website called teachcyber.org that part of the money that we were provided by the administration 2 years ago, we work with Purdue University, and they put together a cyber curriculum for K through 12 teachers. So it's a very user-friendly, you don't have to register or ID or anything. If you just go to teachcyber.org, you can look and see the modules that are out there that teachers can plug into different classes in their K through 12 curriculum.
And I think I'd like to mention the NICE K through 12 conference.
Oh, please, okay,
up.
okay.
The National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, okay, I got that right, which is housed in NIST, runs a conference, a K through 12 focused cybersecurity conference, which I believe is in December in Tennessee somewhere. If somebody is interested in the K through 12 arena and is interested in cyber, I think it's a place to be. It's in San Antonio this year. Thank you. And I would definitely recommend that. Not San Antonio, the conference.
So I lived in San Antonio for 5 years, and I would recommend San Antonio.
Ouch.
Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Richard Wilson from Towson University as well, and
where are you?
right here.
Over there to the right.
Oh, there you are. Hi.
My question is really about K through 12 because my grandson's now in the 6th grade, and in 2nd grade, the whole of Baltimore County was given brand new iPads, and every year they've updated their iPads. The sense of a 2nd grader and the ability to use technology is so far beyond what my ability is, because I'm, of course, a dinosaur. But he can fix anything I have. He doesn't have an iPhone, but he can fix it. And I think there's a couple of issues that emerge because of this. What the social issues are for a 2nd grader is incredible, and how one would actually introduce curriculum related to understanding what cyberbullying is one issue. But even before that issue is the whole notion of what the difference is from Baltimore County to Baltimore City with regard to traditional digital divide issues. And when one starts talking about the intersection of the technical and then the social and legal and ethical issues, this is an incredible task, because the uniformity, even between just a matter of 8, 9, 10 miles, does not exist. And some of these issues, I think, are kind of behind some of what people are saying. So I'd like to hear some of what the comments are.
I think your question is an excellent one, and I think it speaks to the complexity of some of these topics. Terry talked a little bit ago about the partnership we're working on together, and thinking about all the curriculum that we have to pull upon currently. But part of our work is to develop and clarify what is it that we need to do across the K-12 spectrum, both from a curricular standpoint as well as a technology standpoint. And I think what it probably looks like in the K-2 space are skills more related to cyberbullying and how do I use this and how do I use this effectively. And I think this is a complex question, and I'd love for Terry to dive into this question too.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the program that we're working on is going to be designed to reach any kid, anywhere, at any grade, and provide them with the information that they need as well as the teachers need to engage them. And Peter had asked a moment ago about opportunities for a public-private partnership. This is a great opportunity for a public-private partnership. We don't want to reinvent the curriculum that has been developed and all of the great work that has been going on and is still going on, but rather combine forces and develop this program that we envision will begin by reaching 30 million kids and expand from there. Whether they have digital capability at that school or not, the program is going to be geared towards providing the information in a format, so almost platform agnostic, that they'll be able to use immediately. But you also raised another question. It was my point about digital natives versus digital immigrants, and now everybody in here is a digital immigrant. Some probably better than others, but we really do need to take advantage of the fact that these second graders and third graders are digital natives and that they are conversant in this technology. And rather than try to avoid that or tell them to put their iPhones down and don't play with the iPad, we need to figure out a way to actually engage them using those devices. Because, by the way, they're going to do it anyway. And they know a lot more than we do, and they're more facile. Let's take advantage of that and use it to develop and turn out the next generation of cyber literate citizens.
Good afternoon. I'm Hank Hester, NDU, but I'm a Marine by trade. My question builds on Mr. Garcia. You talking about maybe a 4-year degree is not necessarily required, and then building on the midshipmen's back there comment about vocational schools. Why does it seem like apprenticeship programs aren't really talked about anymore as a good gap filler for this, what I would see strategically as a short-term problem, the next 5 to 10 years? Anecdotally, I grew up with vocation in high school. It went away. My buddies are diesel mechanics and MIG welders, and they make $180,000 to $200,000 a year. And they fix the things or create the things that work on the interstates and stuff. We don't expect them to make the laws. Can you give me some insight or your thoughts on why apprenticeship programs always seem to hit a brick wall ever since about the 1950s? Thank you.
Good question.
That is a really good question. And it's a particularly relevant question right now because many of the partners we work with, whether they're on the corporate side or the nonprofit side or the governmental side or the higher ed or the military side, are often looking at us to say, how can our employees support our schools? How can we go into schools? How can we share our career experience? How can we share the work that we do? How can we help bring this topic to light? And it's almost sort of the reverse of the apprenticeship environment, or maybe it's a reimagining of the apprenticeship component. And there's certainly our work internationally. There's a deeper level of engagement still in the concept of apprenticeship. So I think it's a really important question. I don't know that I have all the answers on it right now, but I think there's pathways to making those connections between the career and workforce and the school environment and sharing back and forth those skills and taking the richness of the people who are in those industries and bringing that into our schools, I think is a critical path forward.
I think fundamentally it's a perception problem. The ideal, every parent's dream was to send their kid to college, and that's what we talk about. So there's really an awareness problem, and we do need an awareness campaign that begins to talk about all of these issues. And a component of the problem is how do you begin to develop these apprenticeships, these alternative education pathways, and present it in a way that is interesting and appeals to the public, and that this is, it's not a lesser degree, it's not a lesser occupation, but rather it's a critical component to solving a major national issue.
So one of the things that we did is we talk about the Centers of Academic Excellence, and just as a quick broad brush, we've talked about that. There are universities and colleges across the United States that NSA has designated because they've reached a certain proficiency. They have a certain bar for cyber operations or cyber defense. that as background, we now have where 2-year schools can be designated as centers of academic excellence, where we recognize that folks can go to a community college and get that 2-year associate's degree and have cyber proficiency. I think the problem, as was mentioned earlier, is some of that is perception. People who get that 2-year baseline cyber security education can be functional in a whole lot of jobs across the country. Not everybody needs a master's degree or a PhD. We need some of those people, but if you look at the pyramid, they're going to be the cyber ninjas, and we need a few of them, but not a whole lot of them. So I think a lot of that is perception. I think from an NSA perspective, we're a bureaucracy. We're horrible about that. You have to have a 4-year degree before you can get in the door as a computer scientist. So we're guilty of that. I'm not sure if industry is more agile than that, and maybe industry needs to lead the way a little bit more than what the government does. And the services, you have to have a 4-year degree before you can become an officer, right? So maybe the warrant officer type, solution is what we're looking for to get the 2-year or the apprentice type work for cybersecurity.
Can I comment as well? So I think the first thing I'd like to say is it is picking up. There is a lot of talk about apprenticeships. I think the primary problem is it's an incredibly hard word to pronounce, and that might be the issue here. But having said that, I think the number of times we are hearing this word now has picked up in the recent year or two. I do believe there is, and somebody will have to tell me about this. I do believe there is a presidential executive order. So maybe you can tell the audience a little bit about it as well, which is recent, right? And so now there is a big push behind it. We do need a situation where there can be, in my opinion, at the federal level, but things can, people can have different opinions about it. But I do believe that the issue is big enough that there needs to be a federal level intervention here, and there could be a push behind creating a public-private partnership where these apprenticeships can grow, and we can send our students there, and it would be a nice little experiment on starting it off. But I think more importantly, going off the awareness idea, I think we are ready for a Rosie the Riveter. I think we are ready for Smokey the Bear. I think we are ready for Got Milk. I think we are really ready for a campaign at the national level so these things can pick up, because I do believe that is missing. I think people are not, again, coming back to what I said earlier, we just don't have a national level recognition that can lift up all of these programs that are in fact happening. They're not absent, but to a level where everybody understands and there can be more people playing.
I think Sid has made a very good point about awareness, that we would be well advised to take a look at other campaigns, other awareness campaigns that have been effective, and what were the ingredients that caused that to happen, and see if we can incorporate that into an awareness campaign around cybersecurity. But it has to be done, and also we have to talk about it in a different way too. I notice even on the panel, we're still not quite there in terms of how we talk about apprenticeships and these alternative education paths. There's still some baggage attached to it that we need to get rid of.
I think we have time for one more quick question and some closing remarks.
Hi, my name is Sydney. I'm from the Naval Academy. I have a question about diversity in the cyber force. And maybe this is for Terry or Suzanne mostly.
There is none.
But so I guess my question is, obviously there's a lot of opportunities in the cyber field, but how do we enable women and minorities in these numbers where we have such small numbers without sort of deterring others or seeming biased or exclusive? And I mean, I guess like when I hear things like GenCyber is 51% women, does that mean that like we're turning men away from those programs, or like how did those selection processes work?
Well, I can't comment on GenCyber, but on the diversity issue, it has to begin it has to be everywhere, but it has to begin at K through 12. And we need to make the point, we need to communicate the fact that girls and women are wanted in these programs, that they will excel in these programs, that this old notion that boys are good at STEM and girls are not has to be banished. And using the new technologies, the type of program that we in Discovery have been talking about, I think is one way of beginning to do that, and communicating that this is a field that is open to everyone. And by the way, if we're going to be successful, we're going to have to do that, because just as a practical matter, the talent pool right now is way too small. And one way of expanding the talent pool is to ensure that it is diverse.
And I think to Terry's point, continuing to put the spotlight on those individuals who do represent diversity on a number of levels across all spectrums, and using the distribution channels, using an awareness campaign to be able to say, oh, wait a minute, there are women, there are people from all over the world who are already experts. And when I mean experts, I don't necessarily correlate that with a 4-year degree. Experts at their trade, expert at their craft, expert at their niche specific skill set, whether that skill set came from a high school degree or a 2-year degree or a community college or something later in life or an apprenticeship. I think breaking down the barriers of talking about those things, changing the perception that Terry talked about, and highlighting the successful folks who've ventured down all different pathways to get to where they are. I really applaud the young man who asked the question that he asked over here and raised his hand and said, I'm really proud of the fact that I had this vocational experience as an educator. I had the pleasure of seeing students in vocational environments get jobs so quickly, paid so well, and get tremendous satisfaction about the quality of their work. And I think that is a perception issue that a campaign, distribution channels, and continuing to showcase the people in these fields to help advance the diversity issue are important.
I mean, that's really important, the role models. I mean, what we learned in the Jason project was the importance of role models in the vignettes that we were creating and the awareness campaigns around it, so that the kids could relate to it. As much as I would like to think that I'm still young, I'm not. You need people that are closer to their generation who are doing really cool stuff and present it to them that way, and they go, wow, I can do that too. That's what grabs their attention. That's what's going to captivate their imagination and spark that passion to go into these careers.
So let me just mention, since you mentioned GenCyber, so I'm very interested in GenCyber. I have 3 daughters, so I'm very much an advocate for young ladies. The idea behind GenCyber is to echo what was said earlier, is to get especially young girls to be convinced that they can do this. Because if you look at the numbers, statistically, girls don't stay through math into high school, which means they're not going to get into college and they're not going to get the high-tech degrees. But that's not to say that they can't be involved in cyber. The idea behind GenCyber is when we do these as hands-on exercises, you can see that it's fun, you can see that you can do it, you can see that, girls can do it just like boys. Whether it's any consolation or not, I went to college in the 80s at a big school, University of Texas. We had about 5% girls. So even though things might not be where they should be right now, they're better than they were, 20-some, 30 years ago. And to mention, 50% is our goal. I think the number is about 55% of the girls. Some of the camps that we have are all girls camps. We have other camps that are kind of niche camps as well. We have some just for the deaf. We have some for just Native Americans. But the idea behind that is not that it's a quota. Again, to piggyback what was said earlier, is because girls are in these camps, no boys are excluded. There's lots of other opportunities. There are many more opportunities in GenCyber camps and in schools and universities than there are slots. So plenty of room for males and females to come in.
I think we're just out of time.
Just one other point on diversity. And it's not just gender diversity. It's not just ethnic diversity. It's differences in how people learn. And the system also has to recognize that. And any curriculum has to also recognize that kids learn in different ways.
So we have a few seconds left. Closing thoughts. Brian, I'd like to start off with you. Just a few seconds.
Sure.
Sentences.
Any parents or students in here, NSA is hiring. We have one thing we didn't talk about is scholarship programs. I run a scholarship program within my division. There are DoD scholarships. There are National Science Foundation scholarships, something called Scholarship for Service or CyberCorps. Just Google it. It's what we call a good deal. It's a full scholarship plus a stipend of about $35,000 a year. So I'd be happy to stick around and talk to anybody afterwards if they want to know any of the specifics of that. Parents, student-free, debt-free.
Sid, we're running over time.
Okay. Well, I'll just like the lady who asked this question about diversity to state her name, please. Sydney, you are the role model. I am well aware of what you do at USNA. Maybe you're part of the cyber operations department, maybe you're not, but you've still studied cyber. You are the role model. Spread the word.
Suzanne?
2 homework assignments. I wouldn't be an educator if I didn't deliver some homework assignments. So one is continue this conversation. Tomorrow, talk to somebody about what you learned today. And the other thing I want you to do is some of us have suggested Google this, search this, check this, look into the things that we talked about and learn one new piece about the cyber environment and expand your network so that we continue this conversation.
I think I said enough. I would just, the last comment I made, don't forget the kids that process information in a different way with learning differences.
Thank you very much for being here. Really appreciate your comments. Round of applause.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, thanks, Peter.